Join us for this 6-week series on resurrecting unity and harmony in our world, beginning with our own lives. Well, this is the 4th week of our series on managing conflict. We're doing this series because the gaps in human relationships can be quite treacherous if we don't pay enough attention to them and if we don't navigate them with love. And so what we're doing in this series is learning skills straight out of the Bible for easing tensions and mending hurt feelings. In the first 2 weeks of the series, we talked about, when you're in a conflict, trying to just see things from the other person's perspective, as hard as that is to do when you're angry, mad, and upset. We said it's important to talk directly to that person instead of gossiping about them behind their back, and to assume only the best intentions. Also, we said that being curious about how the other person came to their beliefs and listening to them from the heart goes a long way towards resolving the conflict. And then last week, we turned the focus back on ourselves and we asked the question, what can we learn from this conflict? And if we have the courage, we said that a conflict can actually open our eyes to see ourselves more fully and how what we might be coming across to other people, maybe without even realizing it. And with that kind of focus, by focusing on ourselves, a conflict can actually be a blessing. It can remove the blind spots that we have. It can increase our self-awareness, and it can improve our relationships generally. And it may actually lead us to apologize. And we said there's good apologies and bad apologies. And if you missed any of those earlier episodes of this series, they're all on our website, and we now have a podcast, which is on our website as well, which you can share with your friends. But what do you do when a conflict is intractable? When it just won't go away, when it's built up over a long period of time, and there just seems to be no end to the conflict. What do you do then? Maybe it's a rift between two siblings who have been arguing over an inheritance, or how to care for an aging parent. Or perhaps it's a strained relationship between a parent and a child. It could be a problem dealing with a family member who has an addiction. Or maybe you think your boss at work doesn't like you, or your teacher constantly picks on you. Maybe a bully at school keeps coming back for more. Or a close friend has turned her back on you for some reason and you don't know why. All of these long, stubborn conflicts hurt. And maybe no amount of discussion or apologizing or trying to find common ground seems to work. What do you do then? Well, that's what we're going to talk about this week. And we're going to talk about stubborn conflicts by looking at the readings because they've got great messages of hope and perseverance for us. The first reading especially with the prophet Jeremiah. He faced these same kinds of stubborn conflicts. Of all the prophets in the Old Testament, Jeremiah was the one who suffered the most. He was beaten and he was placed in stocks, and he was put on trial by prosecutors who demanded his death. He was banished from the temple and he was forced into hiding. He was found eventually, he was flogged, and he was thrown into prison. Then he was on house arrest, but then they came and seized him and threw him into a muddy pit and left him there to die. This guy went through the ringer, all because he spoke the truth. And the powers that be didn't want to hear it. You see, Jeremiah was caught in an endless conflict with government officials and religious authorities. So, how did he deal with it? Well, it's pretty simple. He turned to God. And here's what he says in the first reading. Cursed is the person who trusts in human beings, right? Those people who trust in human beings, who do not trust in God, he says, are like withered shrubs in a desert. On the other hand, he says, blessed is the person, the man, who trusts in the Lord, whose hope is in the Lord. He will flourish like a well-watered tree, even in the desert. You see, Jeremiah recognized that there are two ways, the way of wisdom and the way of folly. And the difference is between trusting in God and trusting in human beings and the fleeting pleasures of this world. And at the end of the day, Jeremiah was able to stay the course and get through all of that conflict because he trusted in God. It's the same lesson Jesus was conveying in the gospel story today. In that story, he had just come down from the mountain. He was up there on the mountain praying to God. He was asking his Father for guidance on picking 12 apostles from all the disciples who were following him. And when he had picked his 12 closest disciples, he came down from the mountain and he starts teaching the crowds in a famous homily called the Sermon on the Plain. Now, you may have heard of the Sermon on the Mount, but Luke calls it the Sermon on the Plain because Jesus did not teach from the mountaintop. He came down to the people and he taught them on a stretch of level ground. And there's 3 parts to that sermon. It's a very long sermon. And the first part is what we hear today in the gospel. And in the gospel, Jesus describes these same 2 ways that Jeremiah was talking about in the first reading. Jesus says, those who trust in wealth and fame and pleasure, he says, one day will struggle because they did not trust in God, but in their good fortune. But, he says, for those who struggle now, the poor, hungry, grieving, and persecuted, they are the ones who will truly be happy in the future and who are happy now, because they have no choice but to rely on God, and their close friendship with God gives them hope. And hope brings happiness. Jesus promises that the poor, by persevering, will one day be satisfied. By sticking it out to the end, they will be the ones who laugh. So, hope. That's what Jesus is offering in the gospel. But where does hope come from? I want some of that hope. Maybe you want some of that hope. How do you get hope? Well, hope, Jesus is saying, comes from the ability to persevere through difficult circumstances over a long period of time. Hope comes from sticking with a dream and never giving up. There's a modern word for that today that's all over the internet. I love the word, though. It's called grit. And grit is all over the Bible. It was grit that kept Noah building the ark even when he was being ridiculed. It was grit that kept Abraham believing in God's promise that he would one day have a child. It was grit that kept Moses and the Israelites moving through the desert even when they were starving. It was grit that sustained Jeremiah and the other prophets when they were mistreated. It was grit that kept the apostles preaching in hostile territories. It was grit that kept the martyrs faithful, even to their death. In every generation, it is grit and perseverance that sustains the hope that one day the poor will be rich, the hungry will be filled, and the sorrowful will laugh. So hope depends on grit. Okay, well, how do you get this grit? Well, grit depends on your mindset, how you see the world. There are 2 ways of seeing the world when it comes to grit. One way of seeing the world is that failures in life come from external causes that are permanent and pervasive and over which you have little control. Another mindset is where you think that failures come from temporary and specific causes that you can overcome with hard work. It's all in how you see it. If you believe that you and other people can not really change, that their ability to succeed is limited, then you have what's called a fixed mindset. But if you believe that you and people can change and grow, then you have what's called a growth mindset. And the more you believe that failure in your life can be overcome, the more you will believe that you can do better, and the more you will be able to persevere with grit, and then you will have hope. The worldview you have is actually the product of how you dealt with failure early in your life. And I learned that way back when I was 22 years old. I was in my senior year in college, my last semester. I was majoring in biology at one of the most rigorous academic institutions in the Southeast. It was called Georgia Tech. You've probably heard of it. And not only that, I was working more than a full-time job in a management position, and I discovered 2 years into the program that my brain and science just don't go together. So it was a struggle all the way through. But I had been getting through with good grades, but then something went wrong in that last year. All of a sudden, trying to balance school and my career and my job and everything else in my life stopped working. I was trying to spin too many plates, and now they were all crashing down around me. And I was called into the dean's office for a conversation. That's never a good thing, by the way. I had been taking an independent research course, which means that you're supposed to be doing research all semester, independently, except I hadn't been doing it. I had let everything slip. I hadn't done any of the research, and it was almost the end of the semester. And the dean and my professor made it really clear that if something didn't change in a big way, I wasn't going to graduate. I almost failed out of college. I had fallen on my face hard, and I could have stayed down. I could have convinced myself that I was a failure, that I would never amount to much, and that no matter how hard I tried, I would never succeed. I could have blamed every external cause in the world. I could have blamed my boss for overworking me. I could have blamed the dean or my professor. I could have blamed my parents for giving birth to me. I don't know. I could have blamed the bacteria I was supposed to be studying. I could have done that. And if I had blamed everything else, I would have probably developed a fixed mindset about the world today. But that's not what I did. Instead, I took that meeting as a wake-up call. And I realized that I had been the victim of my own lack of planning. I had overcommitted myself. It was a temporary and specific cause that I could overcome. So, I made some adjustments, and I channeled all my energy back into my studies, and I made a plan to catch up on the work, and I succeeded, barely, on pure grit. And I graduated with an okay GPA. And that experience taught me that anything is possible. Now the thing is, you may be thinking, well, I guess I kind of have a fixed mindset. And that having a fixed mindset can lead you to give up in difficult circumstances. But here's the good news. The good news is that if you do think you have a fixed mindset, you can retrain your brain. And you can choose to believe in a growth mindset. You can practice optimistic self-talk. That's not psychobabble. That's what the neuroscientists are saying today. You can prop yourself up with optimistic self-talk. And you can ask other people for help to help you grow. You can also start believing in other people, especially in those conflicts that never seem to go away. Even when other people disappoint you over and over again, even when you find yourself trapped in unrelenting, stubborn conflict, you can still choose to believe that there is the possibility of change, that the conflict can come to an end, and there can be a reconciliation. Jesus preached the Beatitudes that we heard in the gospel to give hope to the poor, but he also did it to warn the rich. Now, why would he do that? Why would he try to warn people that aren't paying attention to God, who are just relying on their own wealth? Why? Because he believed they could change. Jesus believed people could change. He had a growth mindset, and so should you. Whether it's an alcoholic spouse that you're dealing with, or a know-it-all friend, or a selfish sibling, or an abusive boss, or an intractably negative coworker or neighbor, it's always possible for things to change. If you believe that those negative attributes about the other person are temporary and specific causes of the conflict, then there is hope for the future. And whether it's you writing an encouraging note to a family member with an addiction, or placing that first gentle and loving call to a family member you haven't talked to in a long time because of a disagreement, or whether it's taking a break from prodding and nagging your kids and just making sure they know that you love them, whatever that first step is you're going to take in that conflict, the stubborn conflict you are facing can get better if you persevere and you never give up on the other person and you trust in God, because true grit is powered by God's grace. I just want to finish up with a beautiful movie that I saw this week. It's a literary giant. It's a cinematic giant of a movie. It's made by Disney, and it's called Brave. It came out about 10 years ago. It's an animated movie. It's a kid's movie, but I love them. And I watched it for the first time last week. It's about a 16-year-old princess named Merida living in medieval Scotland. And her parents are the king and queen, and her mom has arranged for her to marry someone that she doesn't love. It's an alliance that would be created between several warring clans, and Merida refuses. She's like, I'm 16 years old. I want to marry who I want to marry, right? I don't want to marry who my mom says I need to marry. So she has a heated argument with her mother, Queen Eleanor. And at the end of that argument, Merida rips apart a family tapestry that symbolizes the deep conflict between her and her mom. And she races off into the woods, and she tries to fix her problems on her own. She encounters a witch. There's always a witch in a Disney movie. And she bargains with the witch for a spell that will change her fate. She asks the witch to change her mom because the conflict was at a standstill, and the way she saw it is that the only way out was to change her mother. So the witch gives her an enchanted cake that Merida offers to her mother, but that only furthers the conflict because it turns Eleanor into a bear, only in the mind of Disney. Well, when Merida realizes that she's changed her mom into a bear, she races back to the witch's house, but the witch isn't there, and she finds a message that says this, that unless she is able to mend the bond torn by pride before the second sunrise, the spell will become permanent. So a lot of things happen. Merida is racing around. She narrowly escapes the clutches of another beast, and so on and so on. You know how Disney is. But at the end of the movie, Merida finally learns that the wound between her and her mother can only be healed by persistent, unrelenting love. And as the sun rises for the second time, Merida comes to see strengths in her mother that she hadn't seen before. And she comes to understand why her mom took the position that she did. And her mother does the same. Both realize their mistakes and they reconcile. In the end, they battle to save each other's lives. What's the lesson? No matter the conflict, no matter how deep the wound, no matter how tragic the results, no matter how long the conflict goes on, never ever give up on minding the gap and mending the bond torn by pride.